Let's get started on Module 4, vCenter Server. There are 4 parts to this module: vCenter Server architecture, installing the vCenter Server appliance, installing the vSphere web client, and using the vSphere web client to manage vCenter Server inventory, which essentially means creating virtual machines. Let's start out with vCenter Server architecture. Let's talk about connecting to ESXi hosts one at a time. You can use the vSphere desktop client to connect to ESXi hosts one at a time. And if you only have one ESXi host, then that's not a problem. But if you have a large data center with a large number of ESXi hosts, then connecting to each one of those hosts one at a time can be awfully time-consuming and labor-intensive. The statement of the problem is that logging on to ESXi hosts one at a time requires that you have a different administrator account and a different password for each ESXi host. This is time-consuming and labor-intensive, especially if you have a large number of ESXi hosts. So the solution is vCenter Server. vCenter Server provides a centralized platform for managing your VMware vSphere environment. vCenter Server allows you to connect to and configure many ESXi hosts with a single login. So if you look at the diagram, at the bottom of the screen, we have you, the network administrator, and you are at your workstation, which is the vSphere client. And then we have all of these ESXi hosts over here. And instead of connecting to the ESXi hosts one at a time, you connect to vCenter. And after you're logged on to vCenter, then you can configure any or all of those ESXi hosts. Let's look at the vCenter Server management platform. vCenter Server allows you to configure and to manage multiple virtual machines running on multiple ESXi hosts, which are connected to multiple data stores. vCenter Server is similar to Active Directory. Active Directory by Microsoft allows you to configure multiple Windows servers from one location. Similarly, vCenter Server allows you to centrally configure and manage multiple ESXi hosts and multiple virtual machines. Single sign-on service. The single sign-on service is a required component of vCenter Server. It is a central repository of vSphere administrative accounts. And the purpose is authentication. The purpose is so you don't have to log on to your ESXi hosts one at a time with a separate username and password for each one. Without single sign-on, then you have to log on to each ESXi host separately, one at a time, separate login for each one. But with single sign-on, you only log on once. Let's look at this, the function of single sign-on. You, the network administrator, types the username and password, and that goes to the single sign-on service. The single sign-on service can either authenticate you from its own database of users, or it can forward that authentication request to another authentication source, such as Active Directory. And then after you have been authenticated, either by the single sign-on database or by Active Directory, then you are issued an access token. And after you are issued the access token, then you can access any one of the ESXi hosts and any one of the virtual machines in your virtual data center. Single sign-on allows us to log in once and to access many hosts. the Platform Services Controller. The single sign-on service runs on the Platform Services Controller. The Platform Services Controller hosts several services. The single sign-on service, which does authentication. It also hosts the licensing service, a certificate authority, and VM directory services. The Platform Services Controller can be installed on a separate computer, or it can run on the same computer as vCenter. If you have a very large organization, you might want to have the Platform Services Controller and vCenter server running on separate computers or separate virtual machines or even separate ESXi hosts. But if you have a smaller organization, then vCenter server and the Platform Services Controller can run on the same machine. With vCenter server, the main point is that vCenter server allows you to manage many virtual machines and many ESXi hosts from one location with a single login and a single password. Centralized administration. Now, there are additional advantages of single sign-on as well, of vCenter server as well. And those additional services are the distributed services. vCenter server provides us with DRS, the Distributed Resource Manager, and what that does is it performs load distribution across multiple ESXi hosts. It provides high availability in case one ESXi host crashes. It provides fault tolerance, which is essentially virtual machine mirroring. They don't call it that, but that's essentially what it is. And then it also provides us with a distributed virtual switch. Now let's move on and talk about vCenter server installation. We have two main methods of installing vCenter server. It can be installed on a separate physical server, or it can be installed on a virtual machine. Now, if you look at this diagram here, you can see that vCenter server is installed on a physical server. Here is you, the administrator, at your workstation. Here are the many ESXi hosts that you need to manage, and here is vCenter server. You, the administrator, logs onto vCenter server, which is running on a separate box, which then allows you to manage all the ESXi hosts, and that's one way to go. But another way to go is to install vCenter server on a virtual machine. So in this diagram, you can see that vCenter server can be installed on a virtual machine running on an ESXi host. What we're going to do is we're going to install vCenter server on a Windows server, which is running in a virtual machine, which is running on an ESXi host. vCenter server additions, if we go to VMware.com, we will see that vCenter server has two additions. There is the vCenter server foundation, which is only good for 3 ESXi hosts, and that's only for very small organizations. What we are going to use is vCenter server standard, which is for medium and large organizations. So let's download the vCenter server installation ISO from VMware. So we go to VMware.com, we go to downloads, and we go to vSphere. And then under vSphere, we can download VMware vSphere. I know we've been here before. And we click on product downloads. Now, we have already discussed the first item here. The first item here is the install program for the ESXi host, which we already did. The second item is what we want. This is the ISO for the vCenter server install program. So I click on go to download, and then we can see vCenter server and modules for Windows, and there is the ISO. Now, it says something about the vCenter server appliance. We'll talk about that one later. What we want is the ISO, vCenter server, and modules for Windows. So I download that. Then after I download it, after I download the ISO, I then burn it to a DVD, and now I have a DVD, which is the install DVD for vCenter Server, and that is called vSetup. Now, to install vCenter Server, what we're going to do is install vCenter Server on a Windows server on a virtual machine. 3 main steps. We create the virtual machine on the ESXi host, assign it 2 microprocessors and 8 gig of RAM. We install Windows Server in the virtual machine and install, of course, VMware tools, and then we install vCenter Server in the Windows Server. And we've already talked about how to create a virtual machine and how to install Windows Server. So really in this section we're just going to concern ourselves with installing vCenter Server on the Windows Server, which is running on a virtual machine. When we install vCenter Server, we can either insert the installed DVD in the DVD drive, or we can install from ISO. Now, an ISO is a file on the data store which appears to the virtual machine as if it were a physical DVD. So what we're going to do is we're going to configure the virtual machine DVD to read from the ISO, which is the install file for vCenter Server. So to do that, I go to the virtual machine, which already has Windows Server running on it. It says vCenter Server here, but it really doesn't have vCenter Server installed yet. And I right-click on that virtual machine, and I select Edit Settings. And under CD/DVD drive, it's currently configured to read from the physical DVD reader in the ESXi host. But if I select Data Store ISO file, then I can browse the data store, and in the data store, I can find the install ISO for the VMware vCenter Server install disk, which they call vSetup. So I click on OK and OK. Then I click on the virtual machine and I click on Power, and I power it on, and it powers on. And then to go to the virtual machine console, I click on the icon for the virtual machine console, and now we are looking at the virtual machine onto which we will install vCenter Server. And now it recognizes the installed DVD, so I click on Auto Run for install, and now here we see vCenter Server for Windows. VMware vCenter Server is a Windows application that manages data center access control, performance monitoring, and configuration. So we click on Install. Welcome to the VMware vCenter Server 6.00 installer. Click on Next to install vCenter Server. We click on Next. We accept the licensing agreement and click on Next. Then we can select embedded deployment or external deployment. When we select embedded deployment, then the Platform Services Controller and vCenter Server will be installed at the same time on the same virtual machine, which is what we want to do for most small and medium-sized organizations. If we had a particularly large organization, we could install the Platform Services Controller and vCenter Server on separate virtual machines on separate ESXi hosts, but we will not do that. We will use the first option. Embedded deployment, we click on Next. Then we type in the DNS name of the vCenter Server, and I will just call it vcenterserver.ccbcmd.edu, and click on Next. And then it says it could not resolve to IP version 6. We are not using IP version 6, so it shouldn't matter. So we click on OK and Next, and then we can create a new vServer single sign-on domain. Typically, by default, we are going to call it vSphere.local. The administrator name, of course, will be administrator, and then we assign a password, and then we confirm the password, then we click on Next. Then we can specify that we will use the Windows local system account which is called administrator, or we can specify that some other account is going to be used to manage vCenter server. We will just use the administrator account. Click on Next. We can select an embedded database, which is what they call a Postgres database. If we had a particularly large organization, we could use an external database, but in this case we will use the embedded database that comes along with the vCenter server installation. We click on Next. Then it tells us the different ports that vCenter server is going to use to communicate, obviously port 80 and port 443. And the reason they mention all of these other ports is so we can make sure to have these ports open in any firewalls that might be between the vCenter web appliance and the vCenter server. We click on Next. Then we specify that we will install the vCenter server, and we will install the platform services controller and the vCenter server onto the C drive of this machine. We click on Next. Then in summary it says it will install vCenter server. It will be embedded. We will use single sign-on. The administrator name is administrator. The local domain is called vSphere.local. So I will click on Install, and then it proceeds to install vCenter server. And then we can see it's loading the VMware directory services. Then it loads VMware vCenter server. Now it's installing the vSphere virtual data center. There goes the VMware inventory service. There is the vSphere web client, which we will use later. There is profile-driven storage. It's now installing the syslog collector, and it's copying performance charts. And now we can see that setup has completed. Your vCenter server is successfully installed. So what we have done is we have installed vCenter server for Windows on the Windows operating system running on a virtual machine. And after vCenter server is installed, we connect to the vCenter server, and we can connect to the vCenter server using the vSphere desktop client, which you are already familiar with, and we can also use the vSphere web client. Let's connect to the vCenter server using the vSphere desktop client, which we have already used. To initiate the desktop client, we click on the shortcut to the vSphere desktop client, and then we type in the IP address of the vCenter server, not of the ESXi host. Then we type in the administrator's name, which is not root. It's administrator at vSphere local. If it's a login directly to the ESXi host, then the administrator name is called root. But if we're logging onto the vCenter server, the administrator is called administrator. We type in the password, we click on login, and now we are connected to vCenter server using the vSphere desktop client. And then at this point we could create virtual machines, but we will cover the creation of virtual machines later on in this chapter. After vCenter server is installed, you connect to the vCenter server either using the desktop client or the web client, and later on in this chapter we will use the vSphere web client. So, in summary, vCenter server allows you to manage many ESXi hosts and many virtual machines from one login, from one location. vCenter server can be installed on a separate physical server, on a separate physical box, or vCenter server can be installed on a virtual machine. We can install vCenter server on a Windows server, which is running on a virtual machine, which is running on an ESXi host. And this concludes Module 1, Part 1 of Module 4. Thank you very much.